the story of Australia, it's the greatest exercise in penal rehabilitation in human history. And I like to think that has been at the heart of our story. People coming here from all corners of the earth in search of a better life, and as long as they have been prepared to have a go, they have abundantly been given a fair go in return, and the vast majority of them succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
In 200 years, Australia has gone from prison colony to one of the world's most successful countries. Testimony is the millions of people who have flocked to live here. We're a country with an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character. It's a great story, but not enough of us know it. And those that do tend to think that it's more of invasion and dispossession than of living together, working together and succeeding together. It's a history to be proud of, with great strengths to build on. So I thought, what can I do to tell the story of Australia, which is truthful, which is as objective as one can be. If you think that we are still the best place on earth to live, if you think you wouldn't want to live anywhere else, well, the history that's created this has got to be something to savour, and that's why I thought it should be better known. But for the IPA, it would never have happened. And so a big thank you to you, to Scott Hargraves, to John Roskam, and of course to all of the members and supporters of the IPA. I think this is a great work for our country, and I also think it's something that the IPA can take great pride in.
Thank you all so much for coming. Everyone here is here because you believe in Australia. Thank you. And you do believe, as the name of the book suggests, that this is a great democracy and that we can still make this Commonwealth of ours renowned of all the lands. And that is also the IPA's belief. So thank you for voting with your feet by being here tonight. In a manner befitting the theme of the book, we welcome all those who can trace their ancestry to the original inhabitants of this continent, all those who were born here, and all those who have made the commitment to become Australian. All are welcome here tonight. We're an independent organisation. We neither seek nor receive government funding. Admittedly, at the moment, we might struggle to get any out of the federal government, but the point is, we neither seek nor receive fundings from government because we prize our independence, and we can only do it because of you. And I can now say because of you and 10,000 members across Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special event where we're here to talk about a very important book that's about Australia, and it's for Australia. It's for an Australia that we all care for very deeply. I speak, of course, of Australia, a history, how an ancient land became a great democracy by the great Tony Abbott. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Tony Abbott.
Well, Scott, thank you. It's wonderful to be in beautiful Brisbane. It's good to be amongst such wonderful patriotic Australians. It's also good to be in the presence of Senator Pauline Hanson and James Ashby, her senior staffer, because Pauline, I should say at the outset of these remarks, you have been far the most constructive of the minor party senators in your time in the Senate. My great political mentor, B.A. Santa Maria, used to say to people who he had some influence over, he said, please, we need to be the best country we can be. And that means that everyone should do their best to help. And for many of you, that will mean joining the political party which best represents your thinking and making it as good as it can be. Now, if any of you want to join One Nation, I think that's a wonderful thing to do once you've joined the IPA. But I do hope that even more of you will think of joining the Liberal National Party because I believe that for all its faults, it remains the best hope of good government in this country. And while it's true of a country like us that we go on doing what we can as individuals every day, regardless of whether government is good or not so good, the fact remains that over time, better governments build countries up, and over time, worse governments drag countries down. And while I have considerable personal respect for our Prime Minister, I do think that this is a government that could do better, and I will be doing what I can to ensure that Australia has the best possible government at the next election. But tonight is not a night to talk politics. Tonight is a night to talk about our country, where it's been, where it is, and where it might go. And the reason why I did something that most retired politicians don't do, I chose not to write memoirs. I chose instead to write about our country because I think the story of us is better than the story of me. I was very keen to do this because I believe that all too often we have been over-influenced by what Geoffrey Blainey once called the black armband view of our history. Now, maybe we needed a corrective of sorts to what Blainey termed the three cheers view of our history, but if anything, the pendulum has gone way too far in the wrong direction. I think we have a history to be proud of. I think that the story of modern Australia, while not perfect, it is a great story. And I want you to think for a moment of the beginnings of modern Australia. Back in January of 1788, some 1,500 bedraggled convicts, Marines and sailors dumped a half away around the world from all they were familiar with and told, basically, you're on your own. And yet, on the 3rd of February 1788, just a few days after the flag was raised and the King was toasted, the Reverend Richard Johnson gave the first Christian sermon ever preached in this continent. And he took as his text, "What can I render unto the Lord for all his blessings to me?" And I think it's that spirit of faith and optimism which has driven our country forward in all the years since then. And it's our responsibility to drive our country forward from now with that same spirit. As I said, 1,500 lost souls almost, chosen by the finest judges of England, but not for their qualities. And yet within 100 years, the Australian colonies had not just developed the world's highest standard of living, but they had become pioneers of liberal democracy. By the end of the 1850s, every man in Australia had the vote. Universal male suffrage, some 60 years before that was achieved in Britain. In the 1890s, in South Australia, people of both sexes and all races could not just vote, but they had the right, at least in theory, to run for Parliament. Nowhere else in the world at that time was that true. And yes, we know that it wasn't all plain sailing for the Aboriginal people of this country. And yet just think of our first governor, Arthur Phillip, a man of extraordinary liberal humanity, a man who took the injunction from the British government to live in amity with the native people seriously, a man who famously said there can be no slavery in a free land and therefore no slaves. Governor Phillip wanted to get to know the Aboriginal people So he inveigled two of the local Eora people, Kalibi and Bennelong, to Government House. Kalibi quickly escaped. Bennelong stayed. Eventually, Bennelong decided to go bush. Phillip went out after him. And in a parley with some of Bennelong's friends at Manly Cove in my old electorate of Warringah, one of Bennelong's friends picked up a spear and plunged it deep into Phillip's shoulder. Now just imagine, this is a British governor of a penal colony who's just been savagely attacked by a native. What do you think would have happened? I mean, normally there would have been a volley of musketry and dozens of the local people would have been dead and injured. But for Phillip, very different. There was no retribution whatsoever. He put this down to a misunderstanding, and within a few days, Bennelong was back in Government House. To be in Government House with Phillip and his team for the rest of Phillip's time as governor, and he actually went to Britain in 1792 when Governor Phillip returned, and was for a time the talk of the town in London. And sure, while Bennelong epitomises, if you like, the cooperation between the first and the new Australians, and Pemulwuy, if you like, represents the conflict between the first and the new Australians, the story at all times from official Australia was that the first Australians, the Aboriginal people, enjoyed all the rights of British subjects. And while we can dwell, and the book does certainly not gloss over these things, while we can dwell on the frontier conflict that did occur, while we can dwell on the massacres that from time to time did happen, we should never forget that it was a story of cooperation, at least as it was one of conflict. Almost none of the explorers could have pushed into territory that was unknown to them, but well known to the Aboriginal people without Aboriginal guides, and almost none of the pastoralists could have succeeded without their Aboriginal stockmen and shepherds, and without the Aboriginal women who kept their homesteads going. So let's not be too black and white, as it were, about our history. Let's not judge our forebears by the standards of today. Let's judge our forebears by the best standards of those days. And I have to say, by the best standards of those days, our early governments really were pretty damned good. So we created something wonderful in our first 100 years, and then, remarkably, we became one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown, not by a process of dictation from London, but by a process of discussion, negotiation, compromise, and ultimately people's vote, which was what created the Commonwealth of Australia. Alone of the nations of the world, we have been so founded. And the nation so founded has been able to endure the savage Federation drought, the Great War, the Great Depression, the Second World War, and then to host an extraordinary wave of post-war migration, to be a country which is today as free, as fair, and as prosperous as any on earth. The fact that millions of people have voted with their feet for Australia is the ultimate vote of confidence in us. It's the ultimate vote of confidence in us, and my hope is that we will more see ourselves through the eyes of the world rather than see ourselves through the eyes of the rather critical quasi-Marxist historians who have dominated our historiography for the last 30 years. Because just as individuals cannot succeed without self-respect, nations cannot succeed without self-respect. And that's why I am launching this book to the Australian public, so that we should have, going forward, the self-respect that we deserve, the self-respect that we need if our country is to flourish in the future as we have in the past. Thank you to all of you for what you have done individually to make our country the great country it is today. In particular, a huge thank you to the IPA, because this book could not have been written but for the help of the IPA. I'll finish on this note. Sometime in the depths of the pandemic, not a very exhilarating time, particularly if you were living in Melbourne, the lockdown capital of the world, I was doing a series of podcasts with John Roskam, the then executive director of the IPA, and we were trying to cheer ourselves up. And we were saying, what could we do to improve these rather bleak times? We eventually came to the conclusion that a history of Australia that was at the very least glass half full rather than glass half empty was just what we needed. John said, Abbott, you write it and I'll help. And that's exactly what happened. Thank you, John. Thank you to the IPA.
Thank you, Tony. Today is an auspicious day. We are here with Tony Abbott discussing Australia, a history. And a wonderful Queenslander, Alan Pidgeon, reminded me as I was coming in that, of course, today, the 10th of December, is Queensland Separation Day. It was 18, and many of you would know that. It was this day in 1859 that Sir George Bowen first arrived here in Queensland. And being in Brisbane, it is significant for us because we are, of course, only 1,300 kilometres away from the demographic centre of the IPA's membership, where the highest concentration of IPA members resides anywhere in Australia. And of course, that's Charters Towers. Freedom lives in Queensland. So Tony, freedom does live in Queensland. Tell us about, let's begin with the contribution of Queensland and Queenslanders to our great nation's history.
Well, I don't want to give away too much that's in the book, but there is plenty of good stuff about Queensland. I like to think that Queensland is the source and the inspiration of Australia as a world power, because in fact it was a Queensland Premier, Sir Thomas McIlwraith, who, in defiance of London, unilaterally annexed the southern part of Papua New Guinea back in the 1880s. Now, I think we need to throw our weight around a bit more than we do and look to Sir Thomas McIlwraith as an example for modern Australian statesmen.
Tony, congratulations on a wonderful history. What struck you about our past as you were working on the book and writing it? Is there anything that surprised you?
Well, I suppose because I was educated in the late 1960s and early 1970s, I didn't get the black armband view of our history. It was a pretty straightforward story of hardworking men and women doing their best and creating a great nation. What I don't think I quite grasped was the high-mindedness that motivated so many of the early Australian authorities. And in this respect, I do want to single out someone who deserves to be much better known to modern Australians. And that's the first Attorney General of New South Wales, John Plunkett. Now, Plunkett was an Irish Catholic who was appointed to this senior judicial or quasi-judicial office at a time when Catholics were still under disabilities in Britain. a man of great humanity and decency. It was Plunkett who responded appropriately to one of the worst outrages in our history, perhaps the blackest moment in our history, and that was the horrific Myall Creek massacre in 1838, when a party of stockmen butchered in cold blood some 30 Aboriginal men, women and children in northwestern New South Wales. When word of this got to Sydney, Plunkett was determined to investigate. He sent out one of his best magistrates to do so. Within a few weeks, a dozen of the perpetrators were put on trial. The first jury refused to convict. As the story goes, one of the jurors in his cups afterwards said that they were as guilty as hell, but we weren't going to hang them for the murder of black people. Plunkett could have let it rest, but he thought this was an atrocity that cried out to heaven for justice. Indeed, that's exactly what the judge at the second trial said, because Plunkett brought fresh charges, reduced the number of the accused so that he could get a better case, and eventually the second jury did convict, and 7 white men were hanged for the murder of black people. Now, I ask you this question. In what other settler colony would white people have been hanged for the murder of black people in 1838? So while it wasn't a great story, there was, if you like, a reassuring sequel that justice was, at least in theory and sometimes in practice, colourblind. There's another good story about Plunkett in the book. Some years later, up on the Clarence, there was another atrocious episode where flour was poisoned and about 24 Aboriginal people were killed. Plunkett again had the perpetrator brought to trial in Sydney. This time, sadly, he couldn't get a conviction because the only witnesses were Aboriginal people, and in those days, Aboriginal people were thought incapable of giving testimony in court because as non-Christians, they weren't able to swear on the Bible. Now, Plunkett in his contemporaneous journals said that an atrocity was committed, which tragically has gone unpunished, but he didn't let it rest. He did try to change the law so that Aboriginal people would be able to give testimony in court. He lost 10-9 in the Legislative Council, sadly, and so it was another decade or so before Aboriginal people were able to testify in courts in New South Wales. Nevertheless, this is a great example of the fundamental decency and fair-mindedness of Australian officialdom, even in the earliest days of our modern existence. And I just think we need to appreciate that from the very beginning, people have tried to do the right thing by their fellow Australians, black and white. Haven't always succeeded, but have nearly always tried. And it's really this fundamental spirit of goodwill, which we see every day in the welcome that we give to migrants, that we see every day in all of the efforts of volunteer organisations and in civil society to do the right thing by their fellow Australians. It's this fundamental spirit of goodwill which I think characterises us and which we must cherish and never lose.
That spirit of goodwill the rule of law, legal process, of course, for Australia, had and has a source.
Mm-hmm.
It is our British heritage. What are the strengths of that British heritage, and why do you think it has been downplayed the way that it has, such that, as Bella de Brera and Bree McKee at the IPA identified some years ago, British history as a subject at Australian universities has almost entirely disappeared?
Well, look, British history up until 1788 is our history, because that was the source for the institutions, the attitudes and the values that came ashore in 1788 and which have stayed with us to this day. And yes, they've been somewhat developed and evolved in this country, and in some respects we've improved on the institutions that we inherited from Britain. I do think that there has been a tendency, again, it got quite strong in the 80s and 90s to deprecate our British heritage. The Republican movement, I think, was a manifestation, a political manifestation of that desire to deprecate our British heritage. I think, if you like, the multicultural mania, again, was a desire, perhaps subconscious in some cases, to deprecate our British heritage. I do think that is now diminishing. I do think that we are now starting to again appreciate our British heritage. For instance, I think if instead of proposing the divisive race-based voice, we had simply asked Australians to approve an addition to the preamble to the Constitution, which specified that the indissoluble Commonwealth under the Crown had an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation, and an immigrant character, that would have been carried overwhelmingly, because it is obviously a statement of true fact, and it is, if you like, a shorthand way of describing our country, and there's something in it for everyone. There's people with Aboriginal ancestry who are properly acknowledged as one of the three pillars of modern Australia. There's the conservatives and the traditionalists who cherish all we have inherited from Mother England. And then there's the millions of post-war migrants who are very proud of everything they've done for our country. And if we are ever to go down this path again of Indigenous recognition, well, I reckon that would be the fail-safe way of doing it.
I'm going to ask Tony a few more questions and then we'll open it up for discussion. Tony, you put personalities and people at the forefront of your history, which is one of the great strengths of the book, which of course is something that modern historians don't do with their left-leaning proclivities. They describe nations and communities as subject to impersonal forces. What are some of you've identified some of the heroes already of Australian history. Who are those that you look to for inspiration and you believe might be particular role models for us?
Well, as even a recovering politician.
Still a politician.
I think ex-prime ministers are like field marshals. They never leave the active service list. John Howard was, after B.A. Santa Maria, was my great political mentor. Every Liberal has got to, I suppose, honour and cherish the memory of Sir Robert Menzies. Something that I guess re-remembered during the writing of the book was the wonderful contribution of Joe Lyons to our country. Joe Lyons almost single-handedly barnstormed the country at the height of the Depression, encouraging ordinary people to subscribe to a loan to enable us to avoid defaulting on our debts, which would have made a bad situation vastly worse at the time, a loan that many of his Labor colleagues wanted the government to default on. So I think Joe Lyons is perhaps our most underrated Prime Minister today, probably because he was ex-Labor and Labor never forgives a rat, and probably because the UAP, which he really created single-handedly, disintegrated after his death. So look, whether we're talking about Carolyn Chisholm, whether we're talking about Simeon Lord or Mary Ryby, the emancipist business people who did so well in early Australia. I mean, even the guy that did this the cover illustration for the dust jacket of the book, George Edwards Peacock. He was a London lawyer, not a very good lawyer it seems, because he was convicted of forging documents and he was sentenced to death. Now that was commuted to transportation for life. He landed up in the late 1830s. Because he was educated, he was sent off to Port Macquarie, where he was in the administration of the prison there. Within a few months, his wife and family had joined him in Port Macquarie. Unlike modern Australians, they preferred Sydney to Port Macquarie. And so when they went to Sydney, he, still a convict, got a transfer to Sydney, where he became a 19th century version of a meteorologist working at the South Head weather station. In fact, all of our early weather records are the work of George Edwards Peacock, and along the way he became one of our better early colonial artists. So this is a guy who should have been hanged for what was then a capital crime. Instead, he was given a new life in Australia. And for so many of the convicts, not all of them, but for so many of them, this was a redemption story. The story of Australia, it's the greatest exercise in penal rehabilitation in human history. And I like to think that has been at the heart of our story. People coming here from all corners of the earth in search of a better life, and as long as they have been prepared to have a go, they have abundantly been given a fair go in return, and the vast majority of them succeeded beyond their wildest dreams.
Australia A History is a bestseller. You're a best-selling author. I had an IPA member from Armidale actually complain to me. Well, he didn't complain. He commented that there wasn't a bookshop in Armidale that had copies of Australia A History because they were all sold out. And he said he was talking to one bookseller who said the only more popular book or books than Tony Abbott in recent memory was Harry Potter. So I've been asked, why do I think the book is so successful and a bestseller? But it's not important what I think. Can I ask the author to speculate on why you think the book has not just been so popular, but struck a nerve?
Okay. Well, look, this is my take on all of that, John. I think 99% of normal Australians think this is a pretty fantastic place. Most of us are instinctively proud of our country, our communities, and I think most of us sense that the history that produced us must have far more good in it than bad. And I think most of us have shied away from the black armband histories that predominate because we know in our hearts that they're not really accurate. And to get a history which does in fact celebrate all the things that have made us what we are, I think has been a real tonic for people. And I think they've thought, well, yeah, finally, here is a story of our country which comes much closer to the truth than something like the dark emu story.
And what people have said to me is, and I say this with Senator Hanson in the audience too, because Senator Hanson, you've done this. You've given us confidence to express our views, to express our faith in our country. And again, IPA polling shows that Australians now like Australia Day more than ever. We like our flag. We believe we have a good history, and really positively, young people are enthusiastically embracing this. What are the lessons from the reception of your book about how all of us, individually and as a nation, gain our confidence back to confront the very great challenges that this country faces?
Well, that's a good question, John. Interestingly, people who are not on my side of politics have really enjoyed the book. There's some generous words in the book.
Peter Fitzsimons.
Well, let's. I wasn't going to start, but there are some generous words in the book from Kim Beazley, the former opposition leader, and I think probably the best Labor man of recent times, never to become Prime Minister, and from Bill Shorten, your great friend, John, Bill Shorten, your schoolmate.
My schoolmate.
Your best man.
My best,
your best man, in fact. There are some wonderful words of tribute in the book from Nova Peris, the first Aboriginal gold medal winner, subsequently a Labor senator. But yes, my mate Peter Fitzsimons, who would agree with me on nothing, did say, and that's here. He said, "This was not quite the it was not quite the white armband view of history I was expecting in the first half, nor the Liberal Party highlights package I was expecting in the second half. I enjoyed reading it." So there we are.
I'll ask Tony one or two more questions, and then Nina and Ashley have the microphone. Tony, it's very significant, and Scott alluded to this, that you have written a history as not just a politician, but a former Liberal politician. And of course, it's been my view and the view of many people that on the centre-right, all the political parties by and large haven't taken culture, haven't taken our history with the due regard it requires, and that of course politics is downstream of culture. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is, and how do we encourage more politicians, and not just politicians, those engaged in public life, to engage in these debates about culture? Because so often when we talk about freedom of speech or freedom of religion or how many flags the Prime Minister should stand in front of, there are some who say, but those are just cultural wars and that's just unimportant. I couldn't disagree more. How do we elevate an understanding of our culture as being really important?
Well, again, that's a great question, John. I think as individuals, we've got to immerse ourselves in the best that's been thought and said. But certainly as leaders, I think we've got to appreciate that what we might take for granted is not necessarily taken for granted by others. And rather than just being silent when people say things that we regard as wrong or folly, we should speak up. I think that for too long, those of us who might be thought of as conservatives have thought that we don't have to explain and defend the things that we see as self-evident. Well, we do. We do. As I have been accustomed to say in recent times, a majority that stays silent does not long remain a majority. And when people say, oh, but it's all too hard, I say, well, sure, effort does not guarantee success, but lack of effort guarantees failure. So I do think, I do think that there has been a reluctance of a lot of supposedly conservative Liberal National Party politicians, a reluctance to speak up on lots of issues, whether it be, I think, the wrong proliferation of acknowledgements and welcomes, whether it be the ubiquitous flying of the flag of some of us co-equally with the flag of all of us, whether it be the politics of climate and identity. I do think there's been a reluctance to challenge it, sometimes out of I guess, misplaced politeness, sometimes out of, I just think, a degree of fear, or this kind of craven adherence to what the focus group pollster has told you. I mean, it really is important that we stand up for the enduring things in our culture and our civilization, because as you absolutely rightly say, John, politics is downstream of culture, and in the end, culture is downstream of faith, and we need to believe in ourselves more.
Well said.